vote?
Well, I've done them.
I told him about it. Yeah.
So should I just let Mr.
Members, the quorum is present. We ask our guests and visitors in the rear of the gallery and the chambers to please stand. We'll ask Pastor Ivan Williams to offer today's prayer. Pastor.
Let us pray. O God of glory and creator of all, truly our day awaits your guiding hand of transformation. Paint within us a tapestry of your divine wisdom and discernment, because we know that whatever you paint is beautiful. Shine down within these halls discernment and wisdom to serve and to serve better this great state of California. We do await on thee because we can do nothing without you. And so, bless us today, guide us today, and teach us today in thy name. Amen.
Members, please remain standing for the pledge. Assemblymember Bradford will be leading us today. Mr. Bradford. Thank you. We'll have the reading of the previous day's journal.
Assembly Chamber, Sacramento, Wednesday, January 20th, 2010. The Assembly met at 6:30 a.m.
Mr. Rico moves. Mr. Blakely seconds that the reading of the previous day's journal be dispensed with. Presentations of petitions, there are none. Introductions of reference of bills will be deferred. Reports of committees will be deemed read and amendments deemed adopted. Message from the governor, there are none. Message from the Senate, there are none. Motions or resolutions. Members, we have We have an 8th grade class visiting us in the Capitol today from Our Lady of Angel School in Burlingame, California. A member, I'm sorry? They're not present yet. Okay, very well. We'll move on. We have visitors from Nancy Skinner's district. Please stand. They're here in the gallery. Let's welcome them. Okay. Thank you for being here. And Ms. Skinner, you may introduce your guest on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm recognizing today Berkeley's Kairos Youth Choir on the occasion of their 20th anniversary. And I have here with me Laura Kakis-Serper, who's the founder and director of the choir, Sophia Sinsheimer, and 8th grader from Berkeley, California, who is the choir president, and Dora Balin and Gavin Williams, who are also choir members. The choir left Berkeley this morning at 7 a.m. to be here with us, and the rest of the members are in the gallery observing us today. Kairos has provided a superb musical education for performing choral music and musical theater to hundreds of children in the last 20 years. And they celebrate the best musical traditions from around the world, including classical jazz, gospel, or rather classical, jazz, gospel, world folk music, and musical theater. There's nothing like hearing the lovely voices of our children raised in song to inspire us and strengthen our resolve to improve our world and make a better future for all of us. I invite you to hear the choir today in the rotunda. They will be singing between 12 and 12:15. And I'll also be very proud to present the Kairos Youth Choir a resolution recognizing their work and their 20th anniversary.
The absences for the day is the Honorable Speaker Karen Bass, the Honorable Sam Blakesley, and the Honorable Amina Carter. Mrs. Ma.
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent for Assembly Members Swanson and Skinner to have guests and photographers on the floor today.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to allow Assembly Members Adams, Anderson, and Garrick to speak on an adjourn in memory today.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to allow Assembly Member Swanson to move out of file order to take up file item 25, ACR 104, relative to Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to suspend the rules to allow all bills heard today and reported on Friday, January 22nd, 2010, and Monday, January 25th, 2010, with a due pass, a roll call, due pass as amended, due pass to consent, or due pass as amended to consent, recommendation from the Committee on Appropriations be ordered to the second or third reading file one legislative day prior to the day required under the Assembly and Joint Rules.
Without objection. Members, without objection, we will move to the second day's consent calendar, item 32. Does any member request or wish to remove an item? Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1374 by Assemblymember Bradley, an act relating to adult education.
Clerk will open the roll on the... We're at the consent calendar and the clerk is preparing to open the roll. Clerk will open the roll. All those voters desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 51, noes 0. The consent calendar is adopted. We'll move to business on the daily file, second reading.
Assembly Bill 781.
All bills are deemed read and amendments adopted. Members, we're going to move to adjourn in memories. Assemblymember Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Members, I would like to rise in memory of J. Putnam Hank, or Putty, who was an integral part of our Lake Arrowhead community. Moving to the mountain communities in 1923, he was a mountain icon. His family is attributed to starting the first school and fire department in the mountains. Putty was very involved in local nonprofits and civic groups within the area. He was a Commodore of the Lake Arrowhead Yacht Club, a Rotarian, and a Lake Arrowhead Citizen of the Year in 2001. His commitment to the mountain communities will always be remembered. Friends, please join me in journeying in the memory of Putty.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, members, today I rise and adjourn in memory of a beloved member of the East County community, Delpha Jean Ennis. Mrs. Ennis will be remembered as a vibrant and enthusiastic community leader. She was a forerunner for women in the construction industry and an inspiration and role model to women everywhere. Mrs. Ennis and her husband Reed started a family business originally known as Ennis Steel Company and now known as Ennis Incorporated. As a small business owner and a crane division operator for over 30 years, Mrs. Ennis knew the meaning of hard work and was very active in the American dream. Largely due to her efforts, Ennis Incorporated today is a pillar of leadership and service to the town of Lakeside. You know, we all have members in our community that go unsung, and Mrs. Ennis was one of those members. Nobody knew all the good things she did because she never took the time to make it known. She was more concerned about keeping her community moving and keeping her community vibrant. And for those reasons, I rise today to remember her. Thank you, members.
Thank you. Mr. Garrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise today to adjourn in the memory of a friend and neighbor, Glenn Bell. He was 86 years old when he passed away on January 17th in his home in Rancho Santa Fe. Mr. Bell was a member of what has been described as the greatest generation of Americans by no less than Tom Brokaw. He served in the U.S. Marines. Mr. Speaker?
Members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Bell served in the U.S. Marines during World War II in the Pacific Theater. After serving, he came home and he opened up a hamburger stand in Colton. A little while later, he decided to move his hamburger stand and change the menu. And he created an enterprise that grew and grew, as we all know, Taco Bell. Glenn Bell formed the Taco Bell Company in 1962 in Downey, California. Taco Bell revolutionized the fast food industry, which at its time, as you can imagine, was limited to just hamburgers. Taco Bell grew to, under Mr. Bell's supervision, 868 locations, and in 1978 he sold it to PepsiCo Corporation. Today, throughout the world, there are over 58,000 Taco Bell locations, serving over 2 billion individuals a year. Mr. Bell was a gracious gentleman. His daughter, Kathleen Flynn, put it best when she said, he never bragged and he was never jealous. Mr. Bell also opened Bell Gardens, his ranch up in the Valley Center area, to free educational trips and to teach children and adults where food comes from and how farms operate. Mr. Bell is survived by his wife, Martha, of 54 years, his sisters Doris, Dorothy, and Maureen, and his daughter Kathleen Flynn, and his sons Gary and Rex, and 4 grandchildren. I ask that we adjourn in his memory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Garrick. Members, I would now like to recognize an eighth grade class from Our Lady of Angel School in Burlingame, California, in Mr. Jerry Hill's district. Please recognize this group. Please stand. Welcome to the Capitol. Members, without objection, I would like to move to file item 25, ACR 104 Swanson, relative to Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Clerk will read.
Assembly concurrent resolution 104 by Assembly Member Swanson, relative to Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Speaker and colleagues, thank you so much for this opportunity to stand before you and recognize the great leadership and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Monday, January 18th marks the 24th national celebration of the national holiday for Dr. King Jr. and his fight for civil rights and humanitarian rights. And so we gather here today to pay special recognition on this day of remembrance. All of us remember what we're doing during this tragic period of the King assassination, but it's his legacy that we celebrate today and his contribution that we celebrate today. And so I offer ACR 104 for our members, and I ask that after our presentations and speeches that in fact it be open for co-authorship. With that, I ask for your aye vote at this time, and would ask the chair's indulgence to recognize our additional speakers.
Thank you. Mr. Furutani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Members, as chair of the Asian Pacific American Legislative Caucus, I stand honorably to celebrate not only Dr. King's birthday, but to celebrate what he and many others started years and years ago. This last weekend, I was fortunate and honored to speak on a panel for the Lincoln Bicentennial, and the theme was Lincoln to King, and I added Lincoln to King to Obama. And what we're talking about is not just individuals that have had a tremendous mark on history and changed the way of the world, but we're talking about a movement that has brought people throughout this world to the understanding that, yes, we can get along, and yes, it's important to acknowledge diversity, and most importantly, it's important to honor how respectful we need to be to each other. If you think about that Chinese student in Tiananmen Square a while ago standing in front of that tank, his colleagues and comrades, arm in arm, were singing, "We Shall Overcome." So I remember not long ago I heard Jesse Jackson speak, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and he shared with people that some people think that King was a dreamer, that some people think that King had lofty ideals. And what Dr. Reverend Jackson said was that Martin Luther King was not an idealist, he was a realist with high ideals. And those ideals are what we need to still subscribe to. Those are ideals that we still need to hold dear, and those are ideals that we still need to fight for. I urge your vote in support for ACR 104. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Mendoza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. I am honored to speak on behalf of a great leader, a wise leader, a true visionary, Dr. Martin Luther King. Many people in our community do not realize that blacks and Latinos have a common history which is deep-rooted in the history of California. We have gone through similar experiences of institutional racism and dealt with educational and economic marginalization. Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement serve as a model for principled leadership and forward thinking. He fought to change the public policy from the self-inflicted wound of segregation to the pluralistic and diverse democracy we have today. In the last months of his life, Dr. King began organizing a Poor People's Campaign to assemble a multiracial army of the poor that would descend on Washington, engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience at the Capitol, if need be, until Congress enacted a Poor People's Bill of Rights. Sort of something like we probably might be dealing with this year with our state budget. In a similar fashion, Cesar Chavez modeled his organizing activities and techniques on the ones that Dr. King implemented and used. Cesar was profoundly influenced by Dr. King's nonviolent message. The movement, which awoke both black and Latino communities and achieved a certain amount of progress in civil rights, were paralleled. The lasting legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King will not only continue to guide those advocating for the poor and underserved. It is with great pleasure that I ask each and every one of you to join us today in celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King. I also want to take a moment to thank Assembly Member Sandra Swanson and as the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus for having this wonderful event and a wonderful breakfast this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of this state legislature. It is an honor and privilege to join in with Assemblymember Swanson on ACR 104 in commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King's leadership and the fact that we honor him in this national holiday. Dr. King's life and his experiences in this country are certainly inspirational and motivational. I am very pleased to see young students in our chambers today as we do this presentation. When we think about Dr. Martin Luther King, he really provided the kind of leadership to challenge this country to be, as in his own words, what it ought to be. And in an attempt to do that, he used this document that brings us all together called the Constitution. And in that Constitution, it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But in fact, it was some of the laws in our court, and I've often spoken about the 1896 decision of the United States Supreme Court and Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate but equal in this country was constitutional. That laid the framework and environment for the challenge that came about in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education that said the reverse, that all people of all colors could enjoy the public accommodations this country had to offer, namely schools. And so this drew the background for Dr. King's leadership. And it was a year later that he took on what I call as a public administrator the greatest demonstration of all times, taking on Alabama and Montgomery in what we call the Montgomery bus boycott. He showed this country what you could do if you were determined, if you were committed and dedicated. And here was a people who were enslaved in their past, who were separate in their present during that time of the 50s, but yet they came together. And I started out this speech by saying inspirational and motivational. Well, I have to tell you that as the country looked to the bus boycott, on that first week, it was inspirational. But by the time of that first month, it became motivational. And then that second month, motivational. And then that third month, motivational. Because it showed us that right could win out over wrong. And that people who appeared to have nothing really did have something if they harnessed that which was given to them. And that was the right in this country, that in fact men are created equal when we use the tools and the minds that we were born with. And they broke the backs of the public transportation system in Montgomery, Alabama. And there was an indictment by the Alabama grand jury because these people had broke the bank. They were running out of money. And can it be that the very people that they needed the money for was mistreated? And so, as we look at the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, it is a leadership in this country that is inspirational, that is motivational. I will conclude by saying two speeches maybe you may not have heard of. Not only is the I Have a Dream speech important, but these two speeches were equally important. One was the Birth of a New Nation that came about in 1957 after Martin Luther King's success in the Montgomery bus boycott. And this was when a country in Africa called Ghana, where many African Americans in the slave trade came from, won its independence from Britain. That became very important and inspirational because it was an example that freedom could take place for people of African descent. And King spoke on the freedom of Ghana. And in fact, he visited Ghana and used that as an example of encouragement, of inspiration and motivation to a people who were about to experience freedom on their own. That example is key in his leadership. And finally, I will share with you the Drum Major Instinct, which was a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about that had both psychological and sociological impacts in terms of how we behave as individuals. The Drum Major Instinct simply is this: it is our desire from within to want to be first. I want to be first. And it is a feeling that babies come out born with. When they cry, they're crying because they want to be first. They want attention. But the danger in the Drum Major Instinct is that as we look at it sociologically, we behave often as groups in the same manner. I want my fraternity to be first. I want my community to be first. I want my race to be first. And it was that Drum Major Instinct that brought America to the conflict and the confrontation that created a foundation for the great leadership of Martin Luther King. It created the racism and the separatism in this country. And so it is with pride that I join my colleague, the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, in celebrating and commemorating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his life for others so that we all, black girls and white boys, might join hand to hand to experience this American dream. And so I finally join in this resolution, and I ask all of us to support it. Dr. Martin Luther King was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Amiano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in deep humility out of respect for Martin Luther King. He was prescient in his inclusiveness. Harvey Milk, a great leader in the LGBT community, used Martin Luther King's inspiration, always addressed the issue of we must help our brothers and sisters, not just focus on the issue of gay rights. Otherwise, it will be a hollow victory. As you know, there are still many struggles in and around the LGBT community, and certainly Martin Luther King, in his ultimate sacrifice, in his words of inclusion, brings great solace and grace in waiting. Patience for the kind of justice he was talking about is hard to exercise sometimes, but it is a virtue. Today at the Martin Luther King breakfast, our Speaker-elect made an erudite speech. Mr. Perez mentioned Bayard Ruskin and his contribution as an openly gay African-American to the March on Washington, and to a march that did not happen 20 years previous because of an intervention by then President Roosevelt. So I stand in solidarity with the Martin Luther King legacy and hope that in the years to come, before I leave this chamber, the LGBT community as well will have the issues that are so blatantly discriminatory today, including Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the gay marriage issue, DOMA, repealed. Thank you so much, and I'm proud to sign on.
Thank you, Mr. Amiano. Mrs. Harkey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I, too, wish to rise in support of this. I was born in the 50s, was a teenager in the 60s. I remember this vividly in my mind, what was going on. And I think one of the benefits of modern communication that the students won't recall is TV became a big product in the 50s. And it was in the late 50s and 60s when everybody had TV. And what was so fabulous and what was so earth-shattering about this new invention and this great man was that it shamed the nation. The nation watched what was going on in Alabama. We saw it on TV, and we were all ashamed. Before that, it had been a local issue. But I think what he did, what Martin Luther King did, was bring it to the national conscious, the national attention of the criminality of the way people were being treated. And so it is to his honor and also to his sacrifice and his death that I think that he gave up his life for what he believed in. And I think we all respect that, and we've all benefited from it. And it's very difficult, I know, for people in California to believe how bad it was and how bad it still can be. California is a pretty unique spot. But when you travel across the country and you see what's going on, I mean, we've come a long way, and it's because of this man and his ability to communicate and his I Have a Dream speech that really shamed the nation and brought everyone's conscience to bear for the responsibility they had for their fellow man. So I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Harkey. Mr. Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an amazing thing when a man's words transcend time. I didn't know Martin Luther King. I didn't march. I wasn't there when he gave his speech. I wasn't even alive. And yet my life is the culmination of somebody else's idea about justice. My parents chose to live a life that honored what Martin Luther King had to say. And so I was raised that way too. In the echo chambers of history, very few things stick with us in a way that pervades every part of who we are. But Dr. King had that effect. Many, many good men and women throughout history have stood up for what is right, but few are memorialized. And all too often it accompanies that person's demise. Martin Luther King Jr. laid down his life for what he believed in. He made the ultimate sacrifice so that I, somebody who didn't even know him, could benefit. I'm so proud to join in this resolution.
Thank you. Mrs. Yamada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Mr. Swanson, I want to thank you very much for bringing this forward to us today. I hope that we will all be able to join you as co-authors. But I did want to remind this body that the state of California established the Martin Luther King holiday and remembrance in advance of the national recognition. Former Assembly Member Elihu Harris brought forward Assembly Bill 312, was signed into law by then Governor Jerry Brown on September 3rd, 1981. And in so many ways, I believe that California has always stood as a bellwether for the nation. So as we recognize the holiday today and the remembrance today, I would like us all to remember that we can lead the nation in solving many of the problems that are vexing us today. And with that, I just want to thank you and appreciate very much the opportunity to join in supporting this resolution, and hope that we will see better days ahead, because I think when we reach inside and respond to the positives that we all carry with us, that we can solve California's problems together. Thank you, Mr. Swanson, for this opportunity to share.
Thank you. Ms. Saldana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, thank you all for your comments. It's hard to think of Martin Luther King as anything except an inspiring individual who raised the bar for human rights. And he did, as chair of the Women's Caucus, I have to acknowledge him for surrounding himself with very powerful women. He recognized that he could not change the world without strong partnerships. He married a woman who went on, it is part of his legacy, to establish a library in his honor, to continue his legacy. And he built on the work of Rosa Parks. He understood how important it was for people to see in a very non-threatening way why something as simple as taking a bus to work should not be determined by where you're able to sit or if you're able to sit at all. And Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president back in the 1980s, was inspired by the leadership that she saw from Martin Luther King. She was the first African-American woman to run for president, and she inspired so many of us who had a chance to meet with her when she traveled around the country. And all of this was based on a strong legacy that Martin Luther King said it is not only, well, let me just revise a little bit about equal rights shall not be abridged by the color, but some would say by the shape of your skin either. Martin Luther King's words moved many. He forged a movement that transcended racial lines, gender lines. His words continue to inspire us today. And it is worth noting that our former governor, Ronald Reagan, was the president who established Martin Luther King Day as a national day of remembrance. So California has had much to do with moving this nation towards honoring a national leader. And we have much to take pride in here in California for our efforts as leaders in this House and in this legislature on spreading that around the country. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to rise as a supporter of this and to be a co-author of this today. And I think it is truly one of those days where we can all agree that this is someone worthy of our respect and of our continuing commitment to equal rights for everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Saldana. Mr. Swanson, you may close.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, let me just say how happy I am that my colleagues in this chamber have spoken with such bipartisan support for the dream of Dr. King, that the caucuses of this body have joined in support of his vision, of all of us working together, and I associate myself with all these distinguished comments before. And I would ask that the first row be open for co-authorships, Mr. Speaker.
Very well. Mr. Swanson has asked that the first roll will be for co-authors. Co-authors, members, clerk will open the roll. Members, this is for co-authors. This is for co-authors, members. This is for co-authors. Co-authors. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Members, there are 67 co-authors. 67 co-authors added. Now we'll have a voice vote on the resolution. All those in favor signify by the normal sign of aye. All those opposed say nay. Ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. We'll now move to the special ceremony to commemorate the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before Mr. Swanson takes the rostrum, we will have an escort committee. Will members Fong, Ma, Silva, Arambula, Adams, Davis, and Yamada please report to the rear of the chambers? Mr. Swanson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. We will begin the official remembrance of Dr. King. We have some very special honorees that we will celebrate, but before our honorees come up and as my colleagues gather as escorts, I'm going to have the Young Adult Choir of Sacramento Metropolitan Chapter come forward to honor us and Dr. King in song. The Gospel Music Workshop was formed in 1967 and is the largest artistic organization of its kind in the world. The Young Adult Choir has performed at many, many events, and we would ask them to honor us as we go forward, and then we will proceed with honoring our special guests. So please welcome the Young Adult Choir, the Sacramento Metropolitan Chapter.
To the King. Lord, you are good and your mercy endures forever. Come and sing, Lord, you are good. Lord, you are good and your mercy endures forever. Lord, you are good and your mercy endures forever. People from every nation and tongue, from generation to generation, we worship you. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. We worship you for who you are. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. People from every nation and tongue, from generation to generation, we worship you. Hallelujah, hallelujah. We worship you for who you are, 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 for who you are. You are good. You are good.
Thank you so much. The Young Adult Choir Gospel Music Workshop. Give them a round of applause. There has been so many elegant presentations today. I just will associate myself with those remarks and say how happy I have been to live during the time of a king. I had the pleasure years ago to meet Coretta Scott King, and what a joy it was to work with her. We all are reminded that Dr. King's dream involves the end of poverty. And so those of us in this chamber will remember that as we go forward with our very difficult task that lays before us. Before our honorees come forward, I at least want to take a moment, just as Coretta Scott King was so important to Martin Luther King, to introduce my wife, Anita Swanson, in the back. Why don't you stand, dear, and right there, stand up and give her a round. Yeah. Yes. It's a partnership. So today we have four great honorees. To help me bring these honorees forward, I'm going to ask my distinguished colleague, Assemblymember Bradford, to take the rostrum. I will ask to help me receive our honorees, if we could have our leadership come forward. Assemblymember-elect Perez and Leader Garrett, if you'd come forward and join me in presenting these resolutions. Please recognize our leadership with a round of applause. And Mr. Bradford, would you do us the honor of introducing our special honorees, and we will receive them accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. On behalf of the California Legislature, it's truly my honor to recognize our honorees and introduce them on behalf of Martin Luther King Day. Our first honoree is Dr. William Lee, Ms. Sherry Harata, Ms. Dolores Huerta, and Dr. J. Alfred Smith, Sr. I'm appointing a select committee on escort to bring our special guest onto the floor for this presentation. Assembly members Ma, well, they've already been appointed. They're there. Our first honoree is Dr. William Lee. He will be escorted by Assembly Members Hall and Fong. Dr. William H. Lee, founder of the Observer newspaper in 1962 with the mission to provide media outlet for the African American community. A legend in the field of journalism and a community leader, Dr. Lee was the chairman of the Dr. Martin Luther King Commission, which was instrumental in making Dr. King's birthday of recognition and remembrance in the state of California. Today, Dr. Lee's publications are a rich resource for the African American community, and the Observer has been recognized as the most honored black newspaper in the nation and has received hundreds of local and national awards. I'm pleased to present to you Dr. William H. Lee. Our next honoree is Sherry Hirota. She'll be escorted by Assembly Members Ma and Silva. As the Chief Executive Officer of the Asian Health Services in Oakland, Ms. Hirota has proven to be an accomplished leader. Since assuming the helm of the Asian Health Service in 1983, she has grown the organization from a staff of 9 and a mere budget of $100,000 to a model multicultural primary care clinic with a staff of 220 and an $18 million annual budget. Ms. Hirota is an advocate and pioneer and is recognized for her vast knowledge of public policy. She has served as advisor to congressional leaders on a myriad of health issues from urban health policy to language access standards. She has received numerous accolades, including being honored as Woman of the Year in the 16th Assembly District. We congratulate and honor Ms. Sherry Hirota. Please come forward. Our next honoree is Ms. Dolores Huerta. Ms. Huerta will be escorted by Assembly Members Arambula and Adams. Dolores Huerta is the president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation and is a legendary activist in the civil rights movement. She has devoted her life to advocating for the working poor, women, and children. Ms. Huerta has contributions to the state have been through her many personal, professional, and civic activities. She is well known for a monumental role that she played in forming the United Farm Workers Union in 1962 with the late Cesar Chavez. She has received many honors, including the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award from President Clinton, and has been honored by the California Legislature as the Woman of the Year. We congratulate and honor Ms. Huerta. Please come forward. Our final honoree is Dr. J. Alfred Smith, Sr. He'll be escorted by Assembly members Davis and Yamada. Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. is a nationally recognized and celebrated theologian carrying on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Through his personal, professional, and civic leadership, he has used the gospel to empower the underserved. Dr. Smith serves as a dynamic role model for all people who believe in the obligation to improve the quality of life for future generations. For 2 consecutive years, Dr. Smith was one of Ebony Magazine's most influential Black Americans. And in 1989, he testified before the United Nations against South African apartheid. We congratulate and honor Dr. Alfred Smith, Sr. While a group portrait is taken, join me in a warm round of applause for today's honorees. Thank you to today's participants and the members for their participation in Assembly's observance of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. This concludes our ceremony. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to have closing remarks?
We'd like to thank all of our honorees, and we'd like to thank this chamber for such a distinguished tribute to the Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Thank you so much.
Let's give our chair of the Legislative Black Caucus another round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Swanson. All right, members. Okay. Members, please be advised of the following. We'll have an Appropriation Committee meeting upon adjournment Friday, January 22nd. No floor session, no check-in session. Monday, January 25th, floor session from 12. Will begin at 12 noon. Last day to notice intent to remove a bill from the inactive file for purpose of amending the bill by the January 27th amendment deadline. Tuesday, January 26th will be check-in session. Last day in the Assembly to submit amendments to the desk by 5 p.m. or before adjournment if any authors wishes to amend by January 27th. Wednesday, January 27th. Floor session will begin promptly at 9:30. Last day to amend measures on the Assembly floor prior to January 31st. Also last day to notice intent to remove a bill from the inactive file to be returned to the third reading on January 29th. Thursday, January 28th, floor session at 9:30 a.m. Friday, January 29th, floor session upon call of the Speaker. Saturday, January 31st, last day for Assembly to pass ABs introduced in 2009, Assembly bills introduced in 2009, and this deadline also applies to urgency and tax levy bills and cannot be dispensed with or waived. The deadline does not apply to resolutions and constitutional amendments. This time I am ready to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Tarico moves. Mr. Hackman seconds that the House stands adjourned until Monday, January 25th at 12 noon. Quorum call is lifted. I don't know.
And you want to know something? You want to know